Good morning and welcome to Bible study. Actually, good noon and welcome to Bible study on May the 8th. We are picking up with Philippians chapter 1 and finally verse 12. We'll be going from verse 12 until the middle of verse 18 or so today. If we quickly get through that, then we will go a little further. And we're going to build our study today around several key questions, four or so. And as an overview to begin, here are those questions. Question number 1. In verse 12, Paul makes reference to something that happened to him that is beginning to be, or that has begun to be, widely known. What was that? Among those who were impacted by this news of whatever it was Paul was referring to about what had happened to him were the Imperial Guard or the Praetorian Guard. What was this group of people and who were they? Next, he refers in verse 14 to his imprisonment, his house arrest in Rome, as we've referred to earlier, as an imprisonment for Christ. We can understand many of the reasons that he would have called it that. Question for us today: is there still such a thing? Can someone be imprisoned yet today for Christ? And finally, for today, I think, the issue came up in Philippi as to the importance of the messenger who carries the message. And some people were saying, and this has come up numerous times throughout the history of the church, that if the messenger isn't of the right quality, then the value of the message is tainted, if not destroyed. So we'll be looking at that, be anticipating your answers. If the message, in this case, the good news, remember evangelion, good news, good message. If the treasure, the message, isn't delivered by someone who is suitable, who's worthy to carry such world-shattering news of such a gift, is it devalued in any way, or is it worth anything at all? So what happened to Paul? What is he referring to in verse 12 that happened to him that caused so much attention as people heard about it? Well, I think there could be some discussion about that, but in all probability, he is referring to a host of things that happened to him going back 4 years earlier. And all or part of this is discussed in the book of Acts. So, for starters, he was in Jerusalem for one of the big Jewish feasts. It happens that that feast was the Feast of Pentecost, and there is a now famous incident where Paul was accused of taking a Gentile, that is, a non-Jew, past the barrier in the great Jerusalem temple, beyond which non-Jews could not go. Only Jewish folks could go past these barriers. If you haven't looked at a drawing of the Great Temple in Jerusalem, you would do well to take time to do that, to see that it's laid out in concentric circles. The furthest out circle is the court of the Gentiles. Anybody, including animals, wild animals passing through, like dogs, animals for sale for sacrifice, non-Jews, anybody was willing or was welcomed to be in that area. And the next area would have been a court of Jewish women. Next would have been the court of Jewish men only. The men could pass through the women's court, but the women couldn't pass through the men's court. On in increasingly smaller areas to the Holy of Holies. And on the barrier between the court of the Gentiles and the first all-Jewish area, that is the court of Jewish women, there was this warning that said, in essence, you have yourself to blame if you cross or bring across a non-Jew and end up dead, because that's what's going to happen to you. Well, Paul was accused of this, and he may have had a part in doing it. It was one of those things, I think, that he never fully owned, but he was dragged out into the street and beaten. Some people wanted to go ahead and lynch him. There was a Roman governor, I think Roman governor named Felix, who had something to do with keeping Paul from actually dying in this attack, and having something to do with getting him out of town. So the people there in Jerusalem who thought he had violated some great Jewish principle would leave him alone. He ended up being sent to Caesarea, where he was put in protective custody, some sort of a prison, not a happy place, but he was safe for a couple of years. During that time, he was approached by Roman authorities who were trying to extort money from him. On what basis? I don't think we know. I don't know. Paul, being a Roman citizen, remember he was both a Jew and a Roman citizen, which was a rare combination, appeals to the Roman emperor that as a citizen he's just being treated in an unspeakably horrible way, and so some loosening up things began to happen. They decide that he can leave Caesarea and go to Rome. On the way, he was in a shipwreck, and that forced him to hang out for a pretty rough winter, I guess. I'm not sure how rough the winters get in Malta, but that's where he was for a winter. And while he was in Malta, for whatever kind of winter they had in Malta, he was bitten by a snake. When it came time for spring, he went on to Rome, and he was under house arrest in Rome for a year, maybe a year and a half, maybe up to a couple of years. And it is probably during that time that he wrote this letter to the Christians in Philippi. Part of how the house arrest worked in this particular situation was that he had to be chained periodically, I guess his free time, or when he was not actually in a cell or something like that. But he had to be chained for 4-hour shifts to an actual Roman soldier. You get to know somebody pretty well when you're chained to them for 4 hours at a time. I think when he maybe went back in a cell or something, this wasn't required of him. But when he was in a free-ish situation and not behind bars, I think that this situation prevailed. So all of that together is what Paul is referring to when he said, "What has happened to me?" It was a lot. The imperial guard to which Paul refers, the Praetorian Guard, was the elite of the elites in service to the Roman emperor. They were his security forces. I'm sorry, my dog is barking. I'm not going to stop. And they were intelligence gatherers, spies, and so forth. Um, they were the forces for protecting the higher ups, and also the forces for gathering the most important intelligence to get back to the emperor. The emperor completely trusted members of the Praetorian Guard. It is possible that it was a Praetorian Guard who had to take a turn being chained to Paul for 4 hours at a time, which I can imagine would have been a high insult. I can also imagine that the newbies on the force, or somebody getting demerit, some sort of a punishment, would be stuck with that job. Certainly would have been something they would not have wanted to do. And you can count on the fact that if they were chained to Paul for 4 hours, that Paul eventually got around to discussing the gospel with them. And he says here in our passage for today that the Praetorian Guard also knew about what had happened to him. I bet he didn't shut up about it at all. No reason that he should have kept quiet about it. He had been through hell. And you can also bet that Paul found his way, to the extent that the guards would have been willing to listen, to share his view of the Evangelion, the gospel, the good news. God's love for them. One God, not many gods. God's love for them, regardless of what their past life had been. This tells us, among other things, that the mighty Roman Empire remained very frightened of the Jesus movement. And as a matter of fact, if the kinds of things that were frightening to them about Jesus in his lifetime caused them to react the way they did to him, then they needed to be fearful of Paul, because the movement had grown exponentially and was now formalized and institutionalized. So, yeah, the emperor puts his finest military personnel on guarding Paul, watching Paul, being attached to Paul, literally, and trying their best to figure out the meaning of everything Paul told them, where he had been, with whom he had had conversations, in the places to which he had traveled, any kind of thing that might suggest kind of an insurrection, which is what Jesus' accusation would have been. And shortly after the time that the book of Philippians was written, within a year or two, the emperor would, as in the case of Jesus, give in and decide there was something just too sinister and too slippery and unwieldy about this person. And even though on the surface the conversations were about love, there must be something deeper, indeed, an allegiance that would cause them, without any question, to have an allegiance deeper than to the emperor that would lead them to do who knows what. As to this matter of being imprisoned for Christ, oh yes. Oh yes, Paul was imprisoned for the sake of the gospel. Paul was imprisoned for preaching what he knew to be the good news for no other reason. Rome feared not his message so much as the power that they believed that somebody who carried his message could have over the adherents to the growing Christian movement, which by the time Paul died in 63 or so, had spread now into not only into the Holy Land, but into the Greek part of the world, into the Gentile part of the world. So Rome was fearful, and Paul was imprisoned. I think for the longest time, Paul did not think that he would die. We will take this up next week. But he misjudged the emperor and the value of his Roman citizenship. So yes, he was imprisoned for Christ, the Anointed One, and so have been many others. Here are just a few. Perpetua, one of the earliest Christian martyrs. Her father begged her, because she was a young mother, a mother of a young child, to renounce her faith so that she could raise her child. But she believed that she could not. And so from prison to execution, she was imprisoned for Christ. One of the most well-known martyrs for the Christian faith, and not everyone who is imprisoned for their faith ends up dying for their faith, but many do, and many are experiencing that today. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the brilliant scholar, the brilliant German scholar, pastor, seminary professor, and ultimately seminary president, who was put in to one of Hitler's work camps because he would not stop defending Jewish people. And he died by hanging in the jail cell. Yes, Christian martyr, imprisoned for Christ. This is Edith Stein. She was a feminist and then a Carmelite nun, or maybe she was always both, or at least maybe she remained a feminist after she became a Carmelite nun. But she too was put to death by the Nazis because of her faith, not just because of her Jewishness, that was plenty, but because of her faith. Imprisoned for Christ. Many Jewish people who were converted to Christianity managed to escape death, but the hardliners in Hitler's movement wouldn't forgive any Jewishness if there had ever been any blood connection. You remember, I hope, Dr. Ernst Lohmeyer from the first session, the brilliant scholar of the New Testament who survived Hitler and then was put to death by the Nazis because he would not stop preaching his faith, which included defense of the Jews from a Christian perspective. And Dr. King, this is a picture of him in the infamous Birmingham jail. He did not immediately die for his faith, and of course his principles of racial equality were clearly grounded in his understanding of evangelion, of gospel, of good news. And once he began to preach the gospel, the good news, he would not stop. And he knew where things were headed for him, but he wouldn't shut up. So, yes, there's such a thing as imprisonment for Christ, and it's going on heavily in the world today. Last question for today. If the messenger of the gospel is not near perfection, is not working toward perfection and doing a pretty good job of it, does the version of the gospel that she or he delivers to you count? Ask another way, does someone who is falling way short, intentionally or unintentionally, at being a follower of Jesus, have any? Does a person like that have any chance of presenting the gospel to you or anybody else in a way that's worth hearing, understanding, trying to understand, and receive? Or does someone who is so flawed from, let's say, somebody's point of view, tarnish the gospel by even handling the gospel to the extent that it would be better not even to hear it at all from such a person? Now remember, as you are formulating your answer to that question, and I suspect I know where most of you who are connected to Silverside Church, visitors who happen to be listening in, I don't know you yet, hope to, one of these days before long. Remember that many people who encountered Paul said that he was not a worthy messenger of the gospel. Why? Because once upon a time, he had another name, Saul. Once upon a time, he lived for another cause. He lived to complicate the lives of followers of Jesus and to persecute them, and according to some stories, without actually throwing stones and being the killer himself, organized execution events for getting rid of people who had no fault other than being followers of Jesus. And though he repented, and though he went in another direction and spent the rest of his life working harder than anybody else ever has since him to share the good news, to be a messenger of the good news, there were plenty of people who believed that his version of the gospel wasn't worth hearing, that it was tarnished, and that while they might forgive Paul for what he had done, that didn't mean that he could ever rise to the level of being able to be a suitable messenger of the gospel, having been somebody who persecuted followers of Jesus and even had something to do, according to what many people said, with the death of some of them. Paul felt very inadequate, very guilty about this for most of the rest of his life, and acknowledged it frequently. Some people forgave him freely, and realized that he had turned in another direction and recanted all of the beliefs that had him acting in the ways that he previously had, even took on a new name. But did he have the right then to carry the prize? Did he have the right to handle the core truth of the faith that for many years had had no impact on him at all and had not slowed him down in his roughing up of those who simply wanted to be followers of Jesus. They weren't messing around with him. They weren't costing him any money or taking any food off his table, but they were calling into question the validity of these intricate ancient laws, which the Jesus movement finally began to say, look, all these minutiae things don't matter. Even Jesus himself, as you know, finally said, look, this may be good for spiritual discipline, and it's certainly good to know how our ancestors thought about such things. But instead of trying to keep a few hundred laws, such as what to eat, when, on what plate, and what days to work on and what days not to work on, all of that, you can summarize all of that in two statements. Love God with everything you got. Number one. Number two, and then love your neighbor as you love yourself. After you have been overwhelmed by loving God with your all. They're in that order for a purpose, I think. I do not think we love ourselves fully and completely. Or at least I do not think we are able to love ourselves to the max until we love God with our whole beings, because in that love, in thinking that love, accepting that love, opening ourselves up to receive the bounty and fullness of that unconditional love, I think we're never able fully to love ourselves. Therefore, there's a lower bar set for how to love others. Do you understand what I'm saying? If so, please nod your head yes. Ha! Caught you. Anyway, thank you for being with me today. We're going to stop there, and I will look forward to seeing most all of you on Sunday morning at 10 for our Mother's Day meditation, followed by communion. If you're going to join us for that on Sunday morning and you haven't already received an e-blast or a text blast from us, and by the way, if you want to receive those and are not receiving them, please send an email message to info@silverside.today, and we will get you on one or both of those lists. But on this particular Sunday morning, if you plan to participate with us, bring something with you when you click on that reminds you of your mother, whether she's still with us in this world or whether she's passed along to God's more intimate embrace in the next world. Something that reminds you of your mom. My oldest niece in Knoxville is really keeping up with family items. She's searching desperately for a handwritten recipe from Mom. Mom was one of the great cooks, and she did write down a few recipes that she used for a bit, but most of her great cooking, the recipe was never written down. We are unable to find it, but we would love to be able to find that for Laura and my niece, and that would make a great Mother's Day gift for her. My sister sent me just a day or so ago a digitized picture of Mom right around her wedding day when she was 19. So many things. Most of us who have the gift of a wonderful mom could bring. But bring that, and then for the communion portion of our service on Sunday morning, bring a little something solid that you didn't finish eating for breakfast, piece of toast, croissant, a little egg, piece of cereal, something like that. And then also leave a little bit of coffee or juice in the bottom of your glass or cup and bring that with you. If there's going to be more than one of you, make sure everybody who is participating at your table or at your house has all of that. Okay? Thanks for being a part of this today. Blessings upon all of you. And again, I hope to see you on Sunday morning. If not, I will see you next Friday at noon.